You ever notice how the anxious person is always painted as the needy one until one day they wake up, realize they've been giving love to a brick wall, and suddenly they're gone? And when that happens, it's not the anxious one who looks weak anymore. It's the avoidant who realizes they've lost the only person who was truly showing up. The harsh truth no one talks about is this: when an anxious partner finally leaves an avoidant one, it's rarely loud or dramatic, it's quiet, it's decisive, and it's permanent. For so long, the anxious partner is the one begging, trying, holding on, over-functioning. And the avoidant believes they'll never leave because the anxious always stays, right? Wrong. There comes a day when the anxious partner doesn't just threaten to walk away, they actually do. And when they do, it's after years of exhaustion, after realizing that love shouldn't feel like chasing a ghost. The avoidant, who thought they had all the power, is suddenly left alone, confused, blindsided, sometimes even desperate. Because the anxious wasn't weak, they were strong. It just took time for them to see that strength. And here's the kicker: once the anxious person finds their self-worth, they rarely come back. The avoidant loses not just a partner, but the one person who was willing to fight hardest for them. That's the moment the dynamic flips. The anxious is finally free. The avoidant is finally exposed. And both are forced to face a truth they've been avoiding all along. Most people look at the anxious partner in a relationship and immediately label them as needy, clingy, or too much. It's an easy stereotype because their behaviors often show up as constant texting, seeking reassurance, or worrying when the other person pulls away. On the surface, it can look like weakness, but when you dig deeper, what's really happening is a form of persistence that comes from two places: love and fear. It's not about a lack of strength. It's about how their nervous system is wired and how much they're willing to fight for the connection they care about. Think about it. The anxious partner doesn't cling because they want to annoy or overwhelm their partner. They cling because they feel a sudden drop in safety when distance shows up. For them, closeness isn't just a preference, it feels like survival. When someone they love goes quiet, takes space, or withdraws emotionally, their whole body reacts as if something is about to be lost forever. So they push harder, not out of manipulation, but out of desperation to restore the bond. They're driven by the deep desire to protect the relationship, even if it means sacrificing their own peace in the process. This persistence often gets misunderstood. The avoidant partner may see it as pressure or control, but from the anxious person's perspective, it's love in action. They're showing up again and again, asking, "Are we okay? Do you still want me? Is this safe?" Because for them, love without reassurance feels unstable. That's why they text after arguments, why they struggle to give space, and why they keep trying to repair even when things feel broken. They believe that if they can just hold on tighter, the relationship will survive. There's also an incredible loyalty in the anxious style. While the avoidant is stepping back, needing air, the anxious partner is holding on with both hands. That loyalty can look unbalanced, but it comes from a place of genuine commitment. They don't give up easily. In fact, one of the most overlooked qualities of an anxious partner is their ability to endure emotional discomfort for the sake of keeping the bond alive. They will sit in uncertainty longer than most people could bear. They will fight through their own insecurities and fears to keep the connection intact. This isn't weakness, it's resilience, even if it shows up in a messy form. Of course, the fear of abandonment fuels a lot of this. Many anxious individuals have histories, maybe childhood experiences where love felt inconsistent, where attention had to be earned, or where emotional safety was unpredictable. That history trains them to overfunction in relationships. They learn, if I don't work hard enough, if I don't chase, I'll lose this person. So when they sense distance, their instinct isn't to step back, it's to lean in harder. They're operating from a belief that closeness can only be secured by constant effort. It's important to see this not as desperation in the negative sense, but as the flip side of incredible devotion. Yes, the behaviors can overwhelm a partner who needs space, but beneath them lies a deep capacity for connection, for care, and for investing fully. Where the avoidant withholds lover's protection, the anxious gives more lover's protection. One builds walls, the other builds bridges, even if those bridges sometimes get shaky under the weight of fear. So when people call the anxious partner too much, what they're really overlooking is that this too muchness comes from a heart that refuses to give up. It's someone who values love so deeply that they'll fight for it long after most would have walked away. And while that persistence can sometimes cost them their own well-being, it also reveals a strength that's easy to dismiss but hard to replicate, the strength to keep showing up even when every sign says to let go. Avoidant partners often carry themselves as if they hold the upper hand in the relationship. They assume, almost unconsciously, that the anxious person will always be there, always waiting, always ready to patch things up no matter how distant they become. It's an illusion of security that convinces them they can pull away without consequence. They believe the anxious partner's need for closeness means they'll never actually leave, because for so long the anxious person doesn't. They stay, they fight, they try harder. And every time they do, the avoidant grows more certain that their space, their detachment, their silences will be tolerated indefinitely. This assumption builds a false sense of power. The avoidant tells themselves, I can retreat, I can shut down, I can hold back, and they'll still be here when I'm ready. It becomes almost like a game of tug of war where the avoidant drops the rope entirely, confident that the anxious partner will never let go of their side. That expectation becomes a comfort blanket for the avoidant. They don't have to risk too much vulnerability because they think the anxious partner will cover the gap with their persistence. But the truth is, this dynamic isn't about real power, it's about imbalance. The avoidant misinterprets loyalty as weakness, mistaking someone's determination to stay as proof they have nowhere else to go. What they don't see is that the anxious partner isn't powerless. They're choosing to keep trying. That choice may come from fear at first, but it's still a choice. And choices can change. When the anxious partner eventually realizes that their constant effort is costing them more than the relationship gives back, the entire structure the avoidant relies on collapses in an instant. The irony is that the avoidant builds their identity around independence and control, but their control is built on a shaky foundation, the anxious partner's willingness to endure. Once that willingness runs out, the avoidant's illusion crumbles. All of the distance they created, all of the walls they built, suddenly become cages, leaving them alone with no one reaching across the gap anymore. They're not in control, they're exposed. This assumption that the anxious will never leave also keeps the avoidant from growing. If they believe the anxious partner will tolerate anything, they have no incentive to step up, to communicate better, or to face their own fears of intimacy. The anxious partner becomes both their safety net and their excuse. I don't need to change because they're not going anywhere. In reality, that stagnation is the very thing that makes the anxious person eventually go somewhere. The avoidant, convinced of their dominance, unknowingly writes the ending of the story. What makes this dynamic even harsher is that the anxious partner often gives countless warnings. They say they're unhappy, they express their needs, they cry out for connection. But because the avoidant is so certain they'll never truly walk away, those warnings get dismissed as emotional noise. It's only when the anxious stops asking, stops pleading, stops checking in, that the avoidant finally realizes those warnings were not empty. By then, it's too late. The anxious has found strength in silence, and the avoidant's false sense of security dissolves. At its core, this whole belief system is a miscalculation. The avoidant confuses dependence with devotion. They assume proximity equals permanence. But human beings don't stay where they feel unseen forever. Even the most persistent, loyal anxious partner has a breaking point. And when they reach it, the avoidant is often left stunned because the very partner they thought would never leave is the one who walks out with a kind of quiet finality that can't be reversed. When the anxious partner finally decides to walk away, it rarely comes with fireworks. There's no dramatic exit, no shouting match, no slamming of doors. Instead, it happens quietly, almost invisibly, after years of inner wrestling. The anxious partner has spent so long over-functioning, pouring themselves into the relationship and chasing after reassurance that when the decision comes, it isn't fueled by anger, it's fueled by exhaustion. They've burned through every reserve of energy trying to make it work, and the realization hits that nothing they do will ever change the avoidance pattern. That moment is like a switch flipping. Suddenly, the chase doesn't feel worth it anymore. What's so striking about this shift is how calm it looks from the outside. The avoidant, who is used to being pursued, expects a storm. They expect begging demands or tears. Instead, they're met with quiet acceptance. The anxious partner no longer tries to explain why they're hurt or push for more communication. They simply stop. They stop asking if everything's okay. They stop double texting. They stop showing up with endless patience. That stillness can be deafening because it signals something deeper than frustration. It signals a decision. The calmness is what makes this exit so final. In the past, when the anxious threatened to leave, it was often a cry for help, a way to test whether the avoidant cared enough to step forward. But when the anxious truly reaches their breaking point, there's no performance left. They don't need to prove anything. They don't need to threaten. They simply reclaim their energy and choose themselves. And once that choice is made, it's not about punishment, it's about freedom. This kind of departure carries a power the avoidant never saw coming. For so long, the anxious seemed trapped in a cycle of pleading and pursuing. To the avoidant, that cycle looked endless, which made them believe they had the upper hand. But when the anxious finally breaks free, the balance of power shifts in an instant. The person who once appeared weak by clinging is suddenly the strongest in the room, the one who had the courage to walk away from what wasn't serving them. And what makes it even more unshakable is that this isn't an impulsive decision. It comes after years of analysis, compromise, and effort. The anxious partner doesn't just wake up one morning and decide to quit. They have already tried everything: more communication, more patience, more forgiveness. They've gone back after every fight, reassured after every withdrawal, and bent themselves in ways that left them exhausted. By the time they walk away, they're certain. They know there's nothing left to salvage because they already tried to salvage it 100 times before. That level of certainty makes the decision irreversible. For the avoidant, this calm exit can feel like betrayal. They're used to seeing the anxious as the one who always fights for the relationship. When that fight disappears, they're left facing the emptiness of their own withdrawal habits. The anxious is gone, not in anger, but in peace. And peace is scarier than rage, because rage can be reasoned with, calmed down, or forgiven. Peace means the door is closed and there's no need to open it again. This calm, final departure is what makes the anxious partner's choice so powerful. It's not loud, but it is absolute. It's the kind of ending that doesn't leave room for negotiation because it isn't about convincing the avoidant of anything anymore. It's about reclaiming self, respect, and choosing a life where love doesn't feel like a constant chase. Once that realization lands, the anxious partner doesn't look back, and the avoidant is left to grapple with the silence they never thought would come. The moment the anxious partner finally leaves, the avoidant is often left in shock. For so long, they've believed that distance, withdrawal, or silence would be tolerated indefinitely. They thought the anxious person's need for closeness would outweigh any frustration, that no matter how far they pulled back, the anxious would always come chasing after them. When that chasing stops, the avoidant experiences a jarring disconnect between what they expected and what's actually happening. It feels like the rug has been pulled out from under them. They're blindsided because the dynamic they relied on, the one where the anxious always reaches, suddenly disappears without warning. Part of the reason it feels so shocking is that the avoidant misread every previous attempt at communication. The anxious gave endless signals along the way: the pleas for connection, the repeated "I need to talk," the tears, the late night messages begging for reassurance. But because those signals had always been followed by forgiveness or reconciliation, the avoidant stopped taking them seriously. They assumed that no matter how intense the complaint, it would end with the anxious settling back into the relationship. By the time the anxious actually leaves, the avoidant has learned to dismiss all the warning signs. What they thought was noise was actually the build-up to silence. That's why the departure hits like a thunderclap. The avoidant is often left confused, asking themselves what happened. Everything seemed fine. To them, it feels sudden, but in reality, it was years in the making. The anxious partner wasn't unpredictable. They were consistent. They were clear about their needs, they were vocal about their pain, and they gave the avoidant countless chances to step forward. The only reason it feels abrupt is because the avoidant never believed those words would be followed by action. When the action finally arrives, it creates a sense of betrayal, as if the anxious did something unfair. But it wasn't unfair, it was inevitable. There's another layer to the shock, the loss of the very dynamic that gave the avoidant security. Avoidants often feel most comfortable when they hold emotional distance because closeness feels threatening. But that comfort is maintained only because someone else is doing the work of maintaining connection. The anxious fills in the gaps, bridges the distance, and ensures the bond doesn't snap. When they leave, the avoidant is forced to sit in the emptiness they created. There's no one running after them anymore, no one smoothing over the cracks. The silence becomes deafening. That silence can awaken a panic the avoidant never expected. They might find themselves suddenly trying to reconnect, sending messages, making calls, or even promising change. The irony is that they finally display the behavior the anxious craved all along, but by then, the anxious is usually past the point of caring. The avoidant isn't just blindsided by the loss, they're confronted by the painful truth that they had the love they wanted and their own defenses pushed it away. It's not just loneliness they face, it's regret. This blindsiding effect is often the turning point for the avoidant. For some, it becomes the first time they confront their own patterns, realizing that what they thought was safety was actually self-sabotage. For others, it becomes a cycle. They retreat into further avoidance, telling themselves it's safer not to get attached at all. But no matter how they respond, the moment itself is unforgettable. The person they assumed would always be there is gone, not because of anger or a fight, but because they finally chose themselves. And that realization, more than anything else, is what makes the avoidant feel the weight of their own walls. True strength doesn't always show up in the beginning of the anxious-avoidant dance. At first glance, the anxious partner can look like the weaker one. The one chasing, begging, adjusting, and apologizing even for things that aren't their fault. They're the ones sending the long texts, asking for clarity, reaching for hugs when the avoidance stiffens, and showing up after every silent treatment. It looks like weakness because they're the one fighting harder, the one visibly afraid of losing the bond. But what often gets overlooked is that this kind of persistence takes enormous strength. It takes resilience to stay invested in a connection that feels inconsistent. It takes courage to show vulnerability again and again to someone who pulls back. And it takes endurance to continue believing in love when every signal says it might not be safe. That's why, when the anxious partner finally decides to stop chasing, the strength that's been there all along suddenly becomes visible. The decision to walk away doesn't come from anger, it comes from self-respect. It's a strength that says, I have given everything I can, I have shown up, I have fought, I have tried, and now I choose to stop abandoning myself in order to keep this relationship alive. That shift is profound. It's not just about leaving a partner, it's about redefining what love means to them. It's no longer about clinging to someone who withholds connection, but about honoring their own need for stability, warmth, and reciprocity. The moment the anxious partner chooses themselves, they move from reactive survival to conscious choice. For years, their nervous system dictated their moves. When the avoidant withdrew, they chased. When the avoidant went silent, they filled the silence. When the avoidant resisted intimacy, they leaned in closer. Their actions were fueled by fear of abandonment. But when they walk away, that fear is no longer running the show. They're not acting out of panic, they're acting out of clarity. And that clarity is a mark of strength. It shows they've learned that love shouldn't feel like a battle for scraps of attention, and that staying in a cycle that erodes their self-worth is far more frightening than facing life alone. This kind of strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it looks like quiet detachment, like no longer reacting to a missed call, no longer feeling the urge to over-explain, no longer needing to be the one who fixes everything. It's the strength of restraint, of refusing to get pulled back into the same patterns. And for the avoidant, that restraint is shocking because it breaks the script they've relied on. The anxious isn't there to bridge the gap anymore. They've stepped out of the dance. What makes this strength so powerful is that it's not just about leaving, it's about transforming. The anxious partner learns that their capacity to love deeply isn't a flaw, it's a gift. But that gift needs to be shared with someone who meets them halfway, not someone who keeps them in a constant state of uncertainty. Their sensitivity, their loyalty, their passion, all the things that once made them feel too much, become their superpower when directed toward themselves and relationships that are truly reciprocal. And perhaps the harshest truth for the avoidant is that once the anxious partner discovers this strength, they rarely come back, not because they're bitter, but because they've outgrown the cycle. They've seen their own value, and once you've tasted that kind of freedom, it's impossible to settle for anything less. What once looked like weakness was actually a waiting period, a time of endurance until the moment they realized they deserved more. That realization is final. It's the point where the anxious partner transforms from the pursuer to the chooser, and from that point on, their story is written on their terms, not dictated by someone else's fear of intimacy. So, when the anxious finally walks away from the avoidant, it isn't weakness, it's strength. It's the moment the person who fought hardest for the connection finally realizes they deserve a love that doesn't require chasing, convincing, or begging. The avoidant may feel blindsided, but the truth is, this ending isn't sudden. It's the result of years of quiet warnings, of repeated efforts, of loyalty stretched past its breaking point. And when that loyalty turns inward, when the anxious stops pouring love into a wall and starts pouring it into themselves, the whole dynamic flips. The harsh truth is that the anxious isn't too much. They're simply giving their love to someone who couldn't hold it. And once they learn to stop apologizing for their depth, they discover that what made them anxious wasn't their nature, it was the imbalance of the relationship. Their sensitivity, their devotion, their passion, all of it becomes the foundation for a healthier, deeper, more fulfilling love story. One that doesn't require them to sacrifice who they are just to keep someone else comfortable. So if you've ever felt like the one who cared more, the one who tried harder, or the one who stayed longer, know this: your strength isn't in how long you hold on, but in your ability to let go when holding on means losing yourself. That's the real turning point. That's when the anxious stops being defined by fear and starts being defined by power. Thank you so much for being here and for listening with an open heart. I know these conversations can stir a lot of feelings, but remember, you are not too much for the right person. The right love won't make you question your worth. It will remind you of it. I appreciate your time, your presence, and your courage to reflect on something so personal and so real. Take care of yourself, value your heart, and never forget, you deserve the kind of love you don't have to chase. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.